I am so happy and honored to be here this weekend. And as it was mentioned, I'm with the Higashi Honganji, and since we don't have any formal relations with the Kyodan in Canada, I never thought that I would be invited to speak at a temple in Canada. I do have, as Akuna-sensei mentioned, many friends who are ministers of Nishi Honganji or BCA temples throughout the U.S. As an organization, we're separate, and although we had the same origin, when the Hongwanji was one huge organization, one huge religious organization, we've grown up parallel to the Nishi Honganji for several centuries. But I was talking to Aok-sensei this evening, and I was telling him that both on my mother's side and my father's side, well, I come from a long line of ministers, or Shinshu ministers, and on my mother's side, she had like something like 9 brothers and sisters, and so just about half of them are with Nishi temples, and half are with Higashi temples. And my father, he had 2 sisters and a brother, and 3 of them were Higashi temples, and 1 is a Nishi temple. And so whenever we get together as with relatives, we kind of what do you call it? Make fun of each other. And we say, the Higashi guys would say, oh, the Nishi temples, their chanting is so slow, or things like that. And there are like subtle differences. When you look at the altar, our pillars are black lacquer instead of gold, and some of the decorations, like the candle holder, the hanging lanterns, and so forth, a little bit different. But of course, in the middle is enshrined Amida Buddha, and so we have much more in common than we do, apart. We have, of course, the same spiritual forebear, Shinran Shonin, but after being apart for so many years, there are slight differences in how we conduct services and so forth. As Akuna-sensei mentioned, I'm currently serving as the Rinban of the Higashi Honganji Betsuin in Los Angeles, the largest of our 5 temples, and a position that I've held since 1993. And since, as he mentioned, since 2010, I've been serving as the so-called bishop of the North America district. You use the word, the title social, and that's much more appropriate, I think. We at Higashi Honganji, we use this term called kantoku. And kantoku is a word that's used for movie directors. It basically means director. And so movie directors, and then also like baseball team managers, they're also called kantoku. And so I'm not really sure what my role is, kind of like more like the manager of a baseball team or something like that. But although we don't have any temples in Canada, we do have overseas districts in Hawaii and also in South America, like Nishi Honganji does. Aok-sensei asked me for a topic for this evening's talk, and so I came up with finding Shinran Shonin in our everyday lives. As I'm sure it's the same with all of you, same with you, over the past maybe 4 years or so, we've been focusing on Shinran in light of the 750th memorial services that were held last year at our mother temples, our Hongwanji in Kyoto. And this year in Los Angeles, or in our district, we'll be observing our 750th memorial services in November. And so that I thought that to think about Shinran Shonin, how he lived, and then trying to implement some of that lifestyle and some of those teachings in our everyday lives is kind of like the challenge that we receive. I thought, though, that I would, Akuna-sensei already introduced a little bit about me, but I thought that I would tell you a little bit more. As you can probably tell, I was raised in the United States, and unlike your bishop, I was born in Japan as the eldest son of a temple family in Tokyo. And my father, he was the second son of his temple in Fukuoka, and met my mother, and they got married, and he became, he entered the Ito family as a Yoshi. And but then my grandfather, back when I was born, when my two older sisters were being born, was still very healthy, and he was still running the temple. And so my father worked at the Honzan for a while, and then later he was sent out to serve as the Dungan of many Betsuins and also the head of various districts. And so like my oldest sister was born in Tokyo, my second sister was born in Kyoto, and I just happened to have been born in Kumamoto, although we don't have any family roots there, we don't have any relatives, but that's where my parents were when I was born. And then 2 years later, he was sent to Hokkaido, where Aoki-sensei is from. And so I lived in Hokkaido for a couple of years. And then during that time, my father was asked to come to Los Angeles to serve as the Rinban for a short while. And he actually refused the nomination because he said, I was a terrible English student. And the interesting thing was that you've heard of D.T. Suzuki. I'm sorry. Yeah, D.T. Suzuki. And he was a Zen priest, of course, but after he retired from, I guess it was Kyoto University, he was teaching, he accepted a position at Otan University, and he was teaching there. And little by little, he became more and more Jodo Shinshu. And his wife, Beatrice Lane Suzuki, was living in Kyoto with him, and she was teaching at Otan University. And so my father had as his English teacher, Beatrice Lane Suzuki. And he says, I was such a terrible student that even Mrs. Suzuki couldn't teach me English. And so anyways, he actually, he spent his whole career in Los Angeles never really being able to speak English. But then, the Japanese American community at the time was still Issei and younger Nisei, and so he didn't have a problem. But at any rate, he said that I can't go to the United States because of his English problem, and then also because he's too old, because he was already in his 40s, and then the third reason was that he had a temple that he was responsible for because he married into my mother's temple. And so he went by himself in 1953, or came by himself in 53, and the three of us and my mother stayed in Tokyo. And 2 years later, it turned out that he realized that he couldn't come back or go back to Japan very soon, and so he called for us to join him. And my father actually served and lived the rest of his life in Los Angeles. But at any rate, because we were living, if we never came to the United States, I would be the head priest of a small temple in Tokyo. And we talk about like these amazing karmic conditions that steer our lives in different ways. And I imagine that all of you, might be in similar case to me, although maybe your grandparents were the ones that came to America or to Canada, and with the intention probably of going back to Japan, but then never did. And then we, were born here, and we, become American. And we could have easily, if it wasn't for that kind of amazing karmic circumstance, we could all be living in Japan and never, have come here. But at any rate, he knew that our temples in the States, overseas, aren't operated like temples in Japan, where normally the eldest son would take over after the father. And so, from when I was young, he never mentioned to me that he would like me to study Buddhism or to think about going into the priesthood. Gave me, pretty much freedom to live and to grow up as I wished. And after finishing high school, my goal was to get out of the temple, to get out of the Japanese American community, which continues to be pretty strong in Los Angeles. and you know, to go to college and just pretty much leave all of that behind, you know, go into so-called mainstream America, and that I would, you know, and I kind of had visions of maybe becoming a lawyer or something like that. And so when I entered Occidental, and Occidental, you know, incidentally, our kind of recent claim to fame is that Barack Obama was a student there for 2 years before he went to Columbia. And so we were real excited. Well, actually, I spent 25 years as the Buddhist advisor at Occidental College after I graduated. And so up until just a year ago, you know, I was serving as advisor. But at any rate, entered Occidental, and then I went, you know, I started out in political science, and then I went to math for a while, and then I ended up in econ in my third year, and none of them really fit, you know, and especially econ. It was like, it was the most boring subject I could imagine. And I just happened to take a course on comparative religions, East and West, because I had this kind of free course. And it was taught by a white Caucasian professor who was a former Presbyterian minister. But he had studied in Japan for a number of years, and he fell in love with Japan, he fell in love with Buddhism. And up until that time, I was kind of thinking to myself, if I was to meet a nice girl and she happened to be Christian, then you know, I could see myself just converting and becoming a Christian. But then when he got to the part of explaining Buddhism to us, I realized that I couldn't be anything but Buddhist. And I, you know, all of a sudden I was really excited about it, because even though I grew up at the temple, you know, through grammar school and junior IBA and so forth, I didn't really have much of an appreciation for Buddhism, because back in those days, all of our ministers were from Japan and they didn't speak English well. And so when, you know, so then after taking that one course, I went to the professor after it was finished, and I said, I'd like to switch over to religious studies. And he said, well, how much time you have left? And I said, well, I have 1 more year. And he says, well, gee, you know, I don't know if you can make it, but if you take all religion during your last year in college, then you should be able to graduate. And that's what happened. And this was back in the mid to late 60s, with all that was going on in the States. You know, the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., counterculture, the hippie movement, the Vietnam War, and all of that was happening. And it was a really exciting time to be there, but then especially for us male students, the draft was always looming over us. And I think that, well, you know, with my newfound kind of interest in Buddhism, and then knowing that if I was to go to Japan, I would be fighting against other Asians, and, you know, Vietnam being a Buddhist country, that it was one thing that I didn't want to do. Well, part of it probably was that I was a coward, but at any rate, you know, I was a part of that anti-war movement in Los Angeles and so forth. And so then I was, you know, in the last year of my college experience, the government, because, you know, this was like in 1970, 71, when Vietnam was at its height, and they weren't getting enough, soldiers, and so they started what they called the lottery system, where they would give every male between the ages of 18 and 26 a number based on your birthday, and then whatever number you had, the chances of you being drafted would be higher or lower. And I got a number, I think it was 156, so right around the middle. And, you know, in September when we started, when I started the last year, I wasn't that worried. But then as time passed, the numbers started to go up and up. And by the time, maybe about 3 months before graduation, it was almost inching up to 120. And didn't really have much plans. And so I was talking to my professor, and he says, well, you know, I think that you should go to Japan and enter a college, Buddhist college in Japan, and study there. And he, you know, he had found out that I was from a Jodo Shinshu family. My father was a minister, and so he encouraged me to study Shinshu. and to go to Otan University. And so it was through his recommendation, his encouragement, that I found myself in Kyoto I think it was September of 1971. I was in Kyoto from 71 to 75, and that decision to study and eventually to become a Buddhist minister changed the course of my life. I've been serving since 1975, and so if I am able to live a few more years, I may reach the 40-year milestone. But to be perfectly honest with you, I'm still trying to figure out what it means to live my life as a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist, to live following the footsteps of Shinran Shonin. One of the things that I tend to emphasize in my Dharma talks is the importance of maintaining the attitude of a student throughout one's entire life. Even for us who are charged with introducing the Dharma to others, actually maybe I should say especially for us, it's extremely important to maintain that commitment of continuing to learn throughout the rest of our lives. We're encouraged to listen much more than to talk, but when we are, say appointed as ministers, realistically, what Sangha would be, happy with a minister who never taught or who never spoke, who only wanted to study and listen. It was Renyo Shonin who once said, "The Dharma is known by people who do not seem to know it. Scholars and learned people cannot explain the true essence of the Dharma. But an illiterate person who genuinely entrusts himself to the Dharma makes others entrust themselves to the Dharma. Therefore, scholars of Buddhist scriptures can never explain the true essence of the Dharma." So what he's saying, I think, is that we can read all of the sacred texts. We can read, the collected works, Jodo Shinshu. We can take college courses and so forth, and yet not get any closer to understanding Shinran. When I went to Kyoto to study, I did take ordination, but I wasn't really thinking about becoming a minister. It most probably was because I grew up watching, the difficult life that my father had. And I was thinking, at the time I was in a master's program, I thought I would go on and get a PhD and then go into teaching. I did receive a master's degree in Shin Buddhist studies, but I knew that I didn't have the brains to go on to a doctorate program. And so I chose to become a kaikyoshi and to struggle in the same way that my father did. And like him, I've never regretted the decision. Even though until like all of my peers, until fairly recently, I've struggled economically, and I've had to be a workaholic and was therefore never a very good father. And so I'm always constantly amazed that my 3 kids, grew up to be decent human beings, and I think the credit goes to my wife, who was there always to nurture them. But like all of you, the profound benefit has been to encounter the Buddha Dharma, and in particular the Jodo Shinshu tradition of Shinran Shonin. I mentioned to you earlier that I'll be going to Japan next week, and we have a program that's been in place for over 20 years now, where we take high school and college students, not very many, usually like 10 of them, to Japan for a study tour. And it includes, or it kind of focuses around a 3-day retreat at our Hongwanji's educational center. They have this facility called the Dobo Kaikan, where people from around Japan, from throughout Japan, come for these 3-day retreats, on a regular basis. And so at any time you might have maybe like 300 people in the Dobo, the Dobo Retreat Center, going through a 2.5-day retreat. And so we live at the Hongwan, we learn of the history of the Hongwan, we listen to lectures and participate in discussions and so forth. And then the second half of the trip usually includes a stay in Hiroshima or Nagasaki to learn about World War II, which is an especially valuable experience for those of us who are Nikkei. I remember when first went to Japan, it wasn't the first time I was in Hawaii, but pretty much, well, it pretty much was the first time I went to Hawaii. Because back in those days, they had planes that, went via Hawaii or via Honolulu. So we stayed in Honolulu for a while, and that was the first time that I had the opportunity to go to Pearl Harbor. And I remember, I was just out of college, the Vietnam War was, still ongoing. And I looked at all of the things that they had at Pearl Harbor, and I was thinking to myself, kind of, because identifying myself as a Japanese because I was born there, thinking, how could my country have done such a terrible thing? And then a few years later, I had a chance to go to Hiroshima, and I went through the museum there, and listened to the stories, and saw the artifacts that remained from the war. And this time, the second time, I was identifying myself as an American and thinking, how could my country have done such a terrible thing in dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? At any rate, every time we take students to those places, it's very moving to them, and I think that they come out of it, with a real understanding of the horrors of war, and come out of it with this feeling that they need to advocate for peace, throughout the rest of their lives. Well, see, for instance, one time when we went to Nagasaki, we had a temple right near the station, and we stayed there. We stayed there for a couple of nights. And right in front of the temple, there's small courtyard, grassy courtyard, sorry. And then there's this big monument, about 10-foot tall monument. And there are 4 kanji, that are engraved on the monument. And it says, Hisen Hikaku. And he means no, arazu. And sen is senso no sen, so war, so no war. And then hikaku, he means, again, no, and then kaku means nuclear weapons. And so it says, no war, no nukes. And then underneath that huge monument, they have a vault. It's like a concrete vault. And I remember the first time we went there, one of the priests there explained the monument and said, you notice that it doesn't say Han-sen or Han-kaku. And when we talk about anti-war movements, whether it's in in the United States or in other Western countries or in Japan, they would use the term Han-sen, anti-war movement. But then he says, in our Shinshu tradition, we would deliberately use Hisen, no war, no nukes. And the reason why, he said, is because when you say anti-war, then you're putting yourself on one side and you're pointing fingers, accusing the other side of advocating for war. But when you say Hisen, no war, no nukes, then you're directing it to yourself. And that it's an encouragement to you to work, for the rest of your lives to prevent that kind of thing from happening ever again. At any rate, this year we're going to be taking the kids to Okinawa, and it's the first time I'm going to be going to Okinawa, so I'm really looking forward to it. But at the Honzan retreat, over the last 6 years or so, we've had a speaker who grew up in Chicago. His name is Reverend Michael Conway. And he's been studying in Kyoto for the past 8 years or so. And he's really an amazing example of someone who virtually came in off the street to encounter the teaching of Jodo Shinshu. He's now perfectly fluent in Japanese, and he reads at a level where he tutors Japanese grad school students in reading kanbun, which is the Chinese, because say the Jodo Shinshu was written by Shindan in kanbun, because that was the the language of literature and scholarly language. And so Michael, he reads Kanban, and he teaches Japanese grad school students how to read. He was a typical young person growing up in the States. He's about 30 years old now. Very intelligent, I'm sure even back then, but he was typical in the sense that he was getting into a lot of trouble. And by his accounts, he was an alcoholic and into drugs in high school. He had a sibling, a sister, died of alcohol poisoning, and his life was spiraling downward, out of control. And so, one day he's thinking to himself, he realized that he was going to die an early death himself if he couldn't change his direction in life. And he was thinking, well, he grew up in a very strict Catholic family, but he, I guess maybe he tried and he realized that Catholicism wasn't going to straighten him up. And he happened to remember a visit to a Buddhist temple in Chicago while he was in high school. And one Sunday in summer, he looks up the address and he goes to the service. Actually, the temple that he visited earlier with a school field trip in high school was the Midwest Buddhist Temple. And the minister at the time was former Bishop Socho Ogui. But he made the mistake, when he was looking in the phone book, he couldn't remember the name of the temple, and so he went to the other Japanese Buddhist temple in Chicago, the Buddhist Temple of Chicago, the temple with Higashi Honganji connections. And he heard a Dharma talk that day given by Reverend Patty Nakai, and he said listening to her talk was like receiving a cool spring breeze on that sweltering summer morning. He went up to her, he went up to talk to her after the service, and then he became her student, and eventually went to Kyoto to study. So he says, when he recites those three treasures, the first two lines are so meaningful to him. It starts, as you all know, well, there are different versions, but our version goes, difficult is it to receive life in human form, now we are living it. Difficult is it to hear the Buddha Dharma, now we hear it. I think most of us, I certainly take those two lines for granted. I don't really think about it. I don't really think about the fact that I was fortunate to be born into human form. I don't really think about the difficulty of receiving the Dharma because I was born into it. But for him, he thinks about how if he had continued on that path of self-destruction, he wouldn't be alive now. He was something like the 11th child of a devout Catholic family, and if it hadn't been for that one visit to a Buddhist temple while he was in high school, he would have never had the opportunity to encounter the Buddha Dharma. So he says that he gave up alcohol, at the age of 21, when most of us started, and he continues to go to AA meetings in Kyoto even today. He has become a true Shinshu follower. Although he's so very talented, he's also so humble and so enthusiastic about sharing his appreciation of Shinran's teaching. In 2008, 4 years ago, we had, on the Higashi Honganji side, we had a World Global Convention that we have every 3 or 4 years. And I was the lead interpreter for that event, and Michael Conway and this other guy, Adam, who both of them who were studying in Kyoto, were kind of like my assistants. And so there was this one unscripted session, and one of us had to do it, and so I asked Adam and Michael, which of you would like to do this session? And then Michael says to me, he says, oh no, I can't do it, in the sense that you're so much better than I am, and so there's no way I could do it. And then Adam, on the other hand, who is a student of Zen, but also affiliated with Hotan University, he says, oh, well, I can do it, and so he does it. And I realized right then that Michael had become a true Jodo Shinshu follower, had learned from the right teachers. And so that even though, like he's so amazing, in terms of how he's grown up as a scholar and as a Shinshu Buddhist, that he has this, this really genuine humility. Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, as you know, is unique in comparison to other forms of Buddhism. Whereas the Buddhism of Shakyamuni Buddha and these Buddhist schools and sects that have developed over the centuries encourage a follower to practice diligently, to polish oneself so that one can climb the ladder towards enlightenment. Well, Jodo Shinshu begins on the premise that for the rest of us, it's impossible to enlighten ourselves through our own efforts, no matter how hard we try. And Shinran Shonin was, the example. He spent 20 years at the monastery on Mount Hiei, and he left as a failure. Basically, he flunked out, although, he did leave at his own choosing. Basically, all other forms of Buddhism present practices to its followers, encourages them to practice diligently such things as meditation, reading and copying the sutras, reciting the Daimoku, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo and the Nichiren tradition, and progress towards enlightenment. Incidentally, though, I heard a Zen colleague tell me once that they do zazen, sitting meditation for hours on end, for days and months and even years, to come to the realization that no matter how hard they try, through meditation, they will not be able to effect their own enlightenment. So I've always thought, that Shin Buddhism had most in common among all the other denominations in Japan with Zen. Let's see, a couple of weeks ago I was invited, our temple's in Little Tokyo, and right across the street is the Jodo Shinshu Temple, the Jodo Shinshu Temple founded by Hongwanji, Shinran's teacher. And so we come from basically the same origin. We recite the Nembutsu, some of the chants like Amida Sutra and Juseigen and so forth are the same. So we have a lot in common. But then when I went to, I was invited to attend their 800th memorial service for Hongwanji. It just happens that 2011 was the 750th memorial for Shinran Shonin, and also the 800th memorial for Shinran's teacher Honan. And so they had the North America version of their Goonki, or 800th memorial for Honan Shonin a couple of weeks ago. And I was invited to participate, to be a guest at the service. And it was interesting, because I've been to the temple many times, but never really thought about the differences and how, I don't know, do you say Namo Amida Butsu 3 times? Okay, well that's kind of a tradition that, we have here, although it's not really a tradition in Japan, as you know, right, as many of you know. When we say the Nembutsu in Japan, nobody leaves. It's just, when you say, when somebody says, okay, everyone join us in Gasho, then everybody just, spontaneously starts saying the Nembutsu. But here, we do have led Nembutsu, and we used to do 3 times too, but nowadays I just do it once, and then everybody's asked to, follow along and recite as many times as you want. Well, Jodoshu, they're much more, rigid in a sense. And, at this big service, the 800th memorial service, they had speakers and the Socho from Japan and, the Hongwanji from Japan and all these dignitaries. And each of them came up to give a short, short readings or a welcome message. And each time that a minister would come up, he would say, okay, everyone, Basho, and then he would say something like Nembutsu Jukan, so 10 times. And then he would start it off, and then everybody would follow in a really loud voice, all saying it in rhythm, and they would say it 10 times. And then after he finishes, he would do it again, and they would say it 10 times. And every person that came up would read 10 recitations of Nembutsu before and after they spoke. And you know, at their temple, they have a beautiful temple, and they have like a Nembutsu hall, and they use those wooden, you know, what they call mokugyo. They're like shaped like a fish, and you use the stick to hit it, and you know, goes pop, pop, or something like that. Anyway, maybe 30 people would sit in the hall, and each one would have a mokugyo in a bachi, and then they would all start reciting Nembutsu, and that's kind of like a meditation, you know, Nembutsu meditation, and it would go on, and they just say Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu, and go on for like 30 minutes, you know, just doing that. And so you could see, you know, the difference between Shindan and Honan. I'm not sure, you know, that it was the difference between Shindan and Honan, or more a difference between Shindan and Honan's other students, you know, because that's how Jodo Shu was developed. Shindan himself always said, my you know, Shinshu, my Shinjin is exactly the same as Honan. And I am a student of Honan, and all that I teach is everything that I've learned from Honan. So anyway, you know, there are these differences. But in Pure Land Buddhism in general, because it was a tradition that had no practice, you know, like the you know, what do you call it, the traditional meditation or the traditional reading of sutras and so forth, that it has been the object of much criticism since it appeared in Buddhism in China. And the most important quality that Shindan possessed was his honesty in reflecting upon himself. In comparison, I think those of us who have been a part of this tradition have learned how to act, you know, to display the signs of humility, of self-degradation to a point. But inside of us, we're not nearly as hard on ourselves as Shindan was. We acknowledge that we're not saints, but at the same time, you know, we think to ourselves, well, we're not perfect, but we're not too bad. We don't go out and commit crimes. We help people who are in need. We donate to the temple and to other worthy causes and so forth. And so we feel, you know, pretty much good about ourselves. But Shindan, after leaving Mount Hiei, came to the conclusion that there's nothing about him that he could feel proud of. And that's why he was so totally grateful to meet his teacher Honan and to encounter the Pure Man teaching. But I think that his growth took another leap when he was exiled to Echigo, you know, to the up in the northern region of Japan, on the Japan seaside. And it was a place where they had, you know, it was one of the, you know, nearly unlivable places. It was barren, very harsh winters and so forth. He was stripped of his rank as a priest and had to depend on the kindnesses of others to survive. So I think it was that struggle that made him even more severe in his self-evaluation, that was expressed in such descriptions of himself as an evil person, or a being filled with blind passions, a person who was unable to be compassionate to anyone. Shuichi Maeda was a student of one of our most important teachers of the 20th century, the Reverend Haya Akebarasu. And he wrote in the book called Evil Person, which was translated by Dr. Nobuo Haneda, the following, to explain Shindan's attitude. He said, "The conviction that all human beings are equal comes from the realization that one is the most evil person in the world. When I become the only evil person in the world, everyone else becomes a good person. I no longer have the luxury of judging others, calling some good and others evil. I form the conviction that all human beings are equal." As you know, like any other form of Mahayana Buddhism, Jodo Shinshu encourages the development of wisdom and compassion. But it's not in the traditional ways. If we try to become wise, if we try to become compassionate, we end up becoming more arrogant. That was Shindan's attitude. We develop such qualities as wisdom and compassion naturally through the process of self-examination. The attitude encouraged is expressed, I believe, in the words of a teacher, unknown teacher, who once said, "Imagine that every person in this world is enlightened but you. They are all your teachers, each doing just the right things to help you learn perfect patience, perfect wisdom, perfect compassion." So even our perceived enemies, even the criminals out there, or even those, terrible drivers that are always cutting in front of me as I'm on my way, all of them are there, are people that we interact with on a regular basis, who we feel don't understand us. But what this teacher and what Shinran is saying is that they are indeed our bodhisattvas, and they're doing exactly the right things to teach us those qualities, to develop wisdom, to develop compassion. During the rest of the time, I thought that I'd share with you some stories that to me illustrate the kind of life that was encouraged by Jodo Shinshu, the lifestyles that emulate the life of Shinran Shonin. At our temple, we have about 50 funerals a year. And about 3 months ago, we had one of the saddest funerals that we've ever had. The youngest son of our choir director, we have a choir at our temple, he was killed in a hit-and-run accident at the young age of 23. He was a young man with unlimited potential. He was a star football player in high school, the valedictorian of his graduating class, and an all-around good person. He had just finished his PhD in aeronautical engineering and had just started at a job in his field. He was killed by a 19-year-old girl who admitted that she had too much to drink, even though she was only 19, and had smoked some marijuana before she took the wheel to go home. She didn't come forward until the next day, saying that when she finally went to the police department, she said she thought she hit a couch or something like that. But then listening to the news, it seemed that was, it was her that ran over this young man. Her friend who was in the car with her, when asked whether they thought they might have hit a human being, replied, "I won't answer that." But at any rate, it looks like she'll be charged with misdemeanor, and she'll get only probation. I don't know that she should be given a much harsher sentence, but probation is a bad message that says you can be underage, get drunk, drive home, and kill someone, and it's all right. In contrast to that tragedy, I'd like to share a similar story that took place in Japan. The story of a dump truck driver who unfortunately was at the wheel when a young child was killed. What happened was he drove a dump truck, and it was towards the end of the day. He had finished his rounds, and he was taking the trash to the landfill to dump. And he was on a fairly big street, and all the cars were going pretty fast, and he was just driving. And all of a sudden, this little girl comes running out into the street, and he slams on his brakes, but it's too late. And so the little girl is run over and killed. And so he was, fortunately for him, there were many people who were there, and they witnessed what happened. And when the police came, they told the police that he shouldn't be blamed at all, because she jumped out into the middle of the street so quickly that no one could have stopped. And so they let him go, and then his employer, his boss, gave him a week off, and so he was at home, and he was just filled with guilt and filled with grief, because he knew that even though it might not have been his fault, that he was the one that was at the wheel when this young 4-year-old girl was killed. And so about a week later, or a few days later, he's looking in the newspaper, and he finds out that there's going to be a funeral service for the little girl at the family home. And so he decides that he wants to go and pay respects to the remains of the child, and to apologize to the parents. But then his friends tell him, maybe it's not a good idea to go, because even though they know that it wasn't your fault, even though they know that you could have prevented it, that the parents might still be angry, and they may, somebody may be angry, one of the relatives might try to throw you out. But then he couldn't stay away, and so he goes to the house, and when he gets there, the priest is still chanting the sutra, and so he walks in very quietly and kind of almost gingerly, and he goes to the front where the oshoko, the incense burner is set. He sits down and he puts his hands in dasho, and in his mind, he's apologizing to the girl, the ashes of which are right in front of him. And then he offers incense, he bows very deeply, and then he walks back to the back of the house to participate in the rest of the service. The service ends, and so then the parents stand up and they thank everyone for coming. And then they notice that he's sitting back in the back of the room, and so they come right directly towards him. So he braces himself because he thinks to himself, this is when they're going to express their anger at me, and he's willing to accept it. So they come right up to him and they bow very deeply to him, and then they say, this is when I get really emotional whenever I think of this story, because it was apparently a true story. But they bow to him and they say, our dear child was taken away from us, and we are we're brokenhearted because of that. But we know that it must have been a very difficult few days for you, because you had to live with the knowledge that you were the driver of that truck. And so we would like to apologize to you for the pain that our family has caused to you. And so he was basically, dumbstruck, dumbstruck by this. He didn't know where that kind of attitude came from. And, he thought to himself, if he was the parent, most likely he would have been very angry, even though, maybe the person who was driving wasn't at fault. And yet he probably would have been very angry, and yet this young couple comes up and apologizes to me. So then eventually they get to know each other, and he finds out that the two of them were children of very devout Jodo Shinshu families. And so they become good friends, and a year after her passing, the three of them go to the cemetery to pay respects. And eventually they start to invite him to their temple to listen to Dharma talks, and he becomes a very enthusiastic Jodo Shinshu follower. When I heard that story for the first time, I thought to myself, if I was the parent, or if I was the driver, would I? Well, if I was a parent especially, would I be able to react in the same way as this young couple did? If I was the driver, would I be able to have gone to a funeral service to pay respect? And I'm not sure that I could have. But anyway, this is one of those stories I think that illustrates to us what it means to live a life, according to our Jodo Shinshu tradition. Another story that I heard is much more kind of mundane, but it's the story of this mother and her daughter. And the daughter, I guess they had lost. She had lost her father years before, and so she was being raised by her mother. And it was time for her to go to college, and so she was leaving her hometown and going to Tokyo to start her college career. And so the mother, she's like, very, worried about her, because it's going to be the first time that she's going to be living away from, they're going to be living away from each other. And she wants her to have the best college experience possible. And so she says, well, you're going to be living in a dormitory, and so maybe we should go, early. Like maybe the college said, okay, be here on such and such a day. So the mother wanted to go like maybe 3 days early, so that she could be guaranteed of having a good room. And so then, they go to Tokyo together, and they go to the college, and they say, my daughter's going to be enrolling in the college, and so we came a little early to be able to pick out our dorm room. But, as you can imagine, they respond to her and they say, well, we don't let our students choose their own rooms. It's kind of assigned randomly, and so you just have to wait until the day and you'll get your room. And so the mother had to go home, and so she leaves the daughter there, and then the daughter is assigned her room. And so it turns out that all of the kind of characteristics of the room that the mother wanted for her daughter were completely the opposite. It was like in a corner of the dorm where there was no sunlight, it was facing the wrong way. It happened to be next to the bathroom, the bath room, and also it would happen to be next to the one telephone that was on the floor. And so it's going to be really noisy, and and then it's going to be a real dark room, and so the mother was so worried. And she said, they talk on the phone and they say, well, can't be helped, so try to endure it as best as you can. Well, about a month passes, and then the daughter calls her mother, and she says, Mom, it turned out that this room was the best room that I could possibly get, because now, it's right next to the phone, and it's right next to the bathroom, and everybody comes, and passes my room, and so I've made so many friends, and then every time a phone call comes, and then I have to go find the student, they're so grateful to me for taking that responsibility. And so it turns out that this was the best room that I could possibly want. And so, it's from the mother's perspective, what she was afraid of was that she was going to have this terrible room. And as things turns out, it turns out that it was the best room that the daughter could have wanted. Another story is a story of a woman by the name of Ayako Suzuki. And she was the temple wife and probably our sensei has heard of her because her temple is in Hokkaido. And she was one of the few young people, she was right around 40, I think, at the time, when she found out that she had terminal cancer. And, generally speaking in Japan, patients aren't told they have terminal cancer, and so it's a kind of a terrible situation because the patient probably knows that he has terminal cancer, he or she, and the family knows, but then they don't admit that they know to each other. And so they're both kind of like living a lie. And in her case, somehow she found out. And so, she reacts as any of us would. Why is this happening to me? I'm still only 40, I have 4 kids, and they still leave me. And so she's reacting with anger and with frustration, anxiety. But then she realizes that she has basically 2 choices. She can continue to be miserable and live out the rest of her life being miserable and taking everyone around her down with her, or she can try to accept it and go on with her life and enjoy the days that she has left. Well, she fortunately lives for 4 more years. And she starts to write, like a diary, starts to write poems, and that becomes the legacy that she leaves behind. So one poem that she wrote, it was called Gan, which is the Japanese word for cancer. And my English translation isn't very good, but it does, I think, get the message across. Cancer, a poem by Ayako Suzuki. When one is told that he is suffering from cancer, most anyone would think immediately about dying. With all of the advances in modern medicine, we are protected from illnesses leading directly to death. Death is something that can strike at any time, but somehow, through a false sense of security, I had forgotten that reality. So grateful, my false self-assurance was destroyed by my cancer. This illness has come to awaken me from my slumber. Filled with deep appreciation, I have begun to awaken to my ignorance, seated before the Buddha to finally receive the Dharma. And so, she comes to this point in her life where she's grateful to the cancer because she feels like she could have lived out, the rest of her life, maybe lived on into her 80s, but then, she would have never come to this kind of true appreciation for life. She would never have come to, the realization that there is this truth of impermanence, which says that our lives can end at any time, and yet it was that cancer, that made her finally, awaken to the teachings of Buddhism. And then she talks about how, like, every night she would be there with her husband, and then she would say to him, thank you for another day. And he finally says to her, you don't have to say this to me every day because I know that you're appreciative. And she says to him, well, but I don't know that I have another day, and so every day I have to say thank you. Another poem that she wrote was written to her 4 children. She starts out by listing all 4. And this poem is called, in Japanese, 子供たちどうか偉くならないで, which is really difficult to translate. I translate it as, children, please don't become society successes. It goes, Keisuke, Daisuke, Shinsuke, Maya. Please don't become society successes. Successful people, they have their noses in the air, their heads raised high. Grow up to be good persons. A good person has his head bowed. Don't mix up being successful with being good. I want you all to taste deeply of life, of all that life has to offer. A person who experiences life in its depths is a good person. And there are many such people in all walks of life, ordinary people. But you won't find many among those who wear medals and badges upon their lapels. That's because the medals of success get in the way of growing up to be good. If for some reason you find yourself laden with medals and badges, don't be affected by that. Be yourself. Be happy with who you are, and taste of life to the fullest. So this is the wishes that the mother imparts to her children before she passes away. And I think that when we think about it, even though like we as parents might, at least on one level, wish that our children will be successful, will at least get a good job, make enough money to be able to afford to buy a house, things like that. But then when we really think about it, we realize that our true wish to our children, the true wishes that we receive from our parents are, to be good persons, to be a person who can appreciate life, who can share, their lives with everyone that they live together with. And I think that that's the kind of example that we receive from our grandparents and great-grandparents. Maybe I'd like to share with you a couple more poems. One or two of them written by a Buddhist poet by the name of Yoshio Toi. And the first one is called When I Awoke. And this poem, he says, was written one day right after he woke up. And it's kind of this revelation that he had. It goes, when I awoke, I found that I was alive. I had not died, I was alive. I had put aside all of my efforts to live as I enjoyed my sleep. But when I awoke, I found that I was alive. On this most wonderful morning, brighter, more wonderful than any since the beginning of time, I was alive. No, rather, I had been given the opportunity to live. So in Japanese, the last line, no, rather, I had been given the opportunity to live, is one of those words that, we don't really have in English, or phrases that we don't really have in English. It says, iya, ikasarete ita. And, so, to live means, ikiru, ikite imasu, I am alive, ikite imasu. But then, from a Buddhist perspective, especially from Jodo Shinshu perspective, I believe, it is this, this understanding of ikasarete iru, meaning I've been given the opportunity to live. To come to that kind of appreciation in life, to awaken to the truth of dependent origination or envy, or we generally translate as interdependence. We're dependent on everyone and on all of life, and that is what gives us, this opportunity to live our lives. Another poem that he wrote, To Live, Ikiru to Iu Koto, goes, digging out a potato from my garden, I noticed the hundreds of ants scurrying back and forth, having had their home underground destroyed. An earthworm moved aimlessly after the disturbance of his home. To live is to create so many difficulties for so many others. Please forgive me. And so this one, when I think about it, I think we've all had that kind of experience, and but then to be able to feel this kind of, this pain, the pain of the ants or the pain of the earthworms, is something that, I certainly haven't gotten to yet. One thing, though, I can say, though, is that when I was younger, maybe 20 years ago, up until about 20 years ago or so, I had, no problem, killing ants or bugs, in the house. And nowadays, every once in a while, if there's a mosquito on the house or something, I will kill it. But then, as soon as I do, I feel this guilt, And so I guess when you think about it in that way, then we are growing, although it may not be very noticeable, whenever you think about it. 2 nights ago was 4th of July evening in the United States, and it just happened. Well, all 3 of our kids are now out of the house, and I only have one. Well, we only have one daughter who's still living in Los Angeles, but she was busy, and then I was kind of busy getting ready for the Vancouver trip, and so we just, Janet and I just spent a very quiet day at home. And so then we're getting ready to go to sleep, and I'm in my bathroom, and she's in her bathroom, and then all of a sudden I hear her scream, a really loud scream, and so then I go over to where she is, to the bathroom right away, and I said, what happened? And then she looks and she says, look at that, and I looked down, and there was a lizard that was this big. Standing in her bathroom. And so then I'm thinking, well, I'm not going to kill him. And so what am I going to do? And so I rushed to the kitchen, and I find this big bowl that we used to put popcorn in. And it looked like it was just about right to fit the lizard. And then I get one of those cutting boards that's kind of flimsy, And so I get that, and then I take it over to the bathroom. And then I really, gently put the bowl on top of the lizard, and then I get the cutting board and I slip it underneath, and I could see him I feel him scrambling and wondering what's happening to him. But finally, I'm able to get him under there, and then I'm able to lift it up, and then I run over to the front door, out to the garden, and then release him. So it worked out okay, but anyways, these are things that even happen in Los Angeles. Let's see, I think I'm running out of time, and so maybe I'll just leave you with a couple more poems. These ones written by a woman by the name of Misuzu Kaneko. And she lived in the early 20th century, and she was a very sensitive person, probably from when she was a child. And she left behind many poems, primarily kind of directed towards children. And she didn't really become, she died quite early in life, and so she really wasn't well known for her poetry until way after she passed away. And recently there's been kind of this revival of Kaneko Misuzu. But the first one is called Tairyo. Well, the other thing was that she grew up in a fishing village. And so, she was always near fishermen. Her parents were fishermen, her father was a fisherman and so forth. And so the first one is called Tairyo, which I translate as the big catch. It goes, in the warm glow of daybreak, I hear the fishermen shouting, a big catch, a big catch, a big catch of sardines. On the shore, a festival to enjoy. In the ocean, a funeral service of sardines for the tens of thousands of family and friends lost in the big catch. And then another one called sakana, or fish. I feel so sorry for the fish in the ocean. Rice are cultivated carefully by farmers. Cows are taken care of by the ranchers. Even carp are given food to eat. But the fish in the ocean are left to fend for themselves. They do nothing to bother us humans, and yet they end up being eaten by me. I feel so sorry for the fish in the ocean. You know, so whether it's this Kaneko Misuzu, or whether it's Yoshio Toi, or Ayako Suzuki, I think, you know, through what they received from their parents and their grandparents, or maybe through what they received from the Buddha Dharma, they become these people, these kinds of persons who can look at life and who can think about, you know, how grateful they are, you know, for the lives that they're able to live, and to be able to feel, you know, that kind of appreciation, even, you know, for the fish. I don't know that we can think about, you know, all these fish who are having funeral services for their relatives, you know, the fish that we eat. But at the same, you know, at any rate, for us to come to that realization, to be able to come to that kind of appreciation, that is, I believe, what we can do in order to be able to find, you know, the teachings of Shinran Shonin in our everyday lives. Well, let's see. I guess I've run out of time, and so I thank you for giving me this opportunity.